Hello, and thank you so much for spending your Sunday evening with us. I am so delighted that we are talking to Manu Pillai right now about his book that has just been out for a couple of weeks.
3 weeks.
Three weeks, okay. So we're at the 3 week mark. And so, Manu, welcome to Bangalore, welcome to the Literary Festival, and let's talk about gods, guns, and missionaries. Before we begin, let's talk about the title. Talk us through the gods, the guns, the missionaries.
Yeah, in fact, several people saw the title and wondered why I chose this particular sequence of words. It was simply because these are the three core themes of the book. Gods, because different people at different times fought over whether there's one god, whether there are many gods, whether the one god has multiple forms which appear as the many gods. So there's this whole question around divinity and what God itself represents for different cultures, for different people. And when cultures come into mutual encounters, sometimes they clash over this question of which god is real, which god is not real, which god is higher, which god is lower. Some people create hierarchies of gods. So that's one angle of the book. The other is guns, and guns is a reference to to colonialism, and to the presence of not just the British, but also the Portuguese before them, and colonial powers in India, and how that affects our religious identities, how we affect them in many ways. We forget that before the British became very confident in India, there was a phase when they were going around and smashing coconuts in temples and escorting Hindu deities in processions and making donations to Tirupati and all of that. White men doing these things. We have Puranic style legends where white men have been drawn in as characters even, because at one point they didn't seem that alien, and they were making a conscious effort to engage with Indian society. But the guns also refers to the revolutionaries in the final segment of the book who were fighting back with guns. And the third element is, of course, the missionaries, because they came to India to convert. They came with certain preconceived notions in their mind about this barbaric pagan culture. In many ways, they affected Hindu society affected them also. They had to transform as much as Hindus had to sort of come up with a response to the pressure of the missionaries, and how that also led to a kind of reconceptualization of the modern Hindu identity. That's why.
So, I want to put a pin in this thing that you just said, which is Puranic style legends where these guys are included into the thing, because this is such a central point in the book where almost everything gets assimilated into the early idea of what, I mean, was it Hinduism at that point when we move from the Vedic age to the Puranic age? Are we even calling it Hinduism at that point? At what point does it become Hinduism?
So in textbook definitions, you'll often find that, okay, first there's Vedic Hinduism as they call it, then there's Puranic Hinduism, and then we have modern Hinduism today, which is a kind of neat, simplistic way of defining it. In reality, as I see it at least, based on my reading, there was the Vedic religion represented in the form of the Brahmin, the orthodox ancient Brahmin as it were. And then this culture, as it moved around different parts of India, there was a notion of the core Desha of the Aryans, right? The proper core heartland in the Gangetic belt. Originally more towards the west, then moves towards the Gangetic belt. And then it fans out to other places.
Yeah.
And that's why initially a lot of places in India were considered Mlecha Desha. So Bengal was considered Mlecha Desha, Sindh was Mlecha Desha, barbarian country. Even going there was to commit sin through your feet. These were not good places. Even in the 19th century, we have a traveler writing that it was sin to die in Patna, because Patna was on the wrong side of the river, so you would be reborn as a donkey. So you had to cross the river and come onto this side to actually die in the right territory. So how this changes, and in the course of this culture spreading, and Buddhism is also spreading, in a similar way, down the same highways, down the same routes.
And Buddhism also gets incorporated into
It also
Hinduism.
does, yeah. And what happens is, they come into contact with a lot of other local cultures, a lot of other ideas. This includes tribal cults, it includes groups that venerate deities through images and idols, as they're called. Which original, Vedic Brahmanism was not in favor of idol worship, as they called it. You had fire sacrifices, and you summoned the gods over there in an invisible form, not necessarily through a puja vigraham, as we call it. So it's coming into contact with a whole set of other traditions. Initially, there's a bit of friction, but then there's a way of co-opting these. And the co-option happens and is most visible to us in the Puranas, because the Puranas, as I write in the book, is a way of connecting the local with the pan-Indian and universalizing that with the local. So it's a way of marrying the two, where each retains a lot of its initial original flavor, but is also slightly modified, slightly turned in order to become part of a larger framework. And in many ways, that framework is what I would define as Hinduism, even though the term is new. That framework is a common way through which all of these systems manage to sort of make sense of each other. And there was a conscious effort, at least on the part of Brahmins, to connect everything into that framework. And often this was done through stories. So you come across a tribal goddess somewhere and you'll say, oh, this is a form of Parvati. And you, through the creation of legends, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's actually a very creative way of knitting together different ideas without denying it, but at the same time making it part of something else. Gods have been married. You have cases where, deities of certain temples get married, and through the marriage they become part of something. You've got a brother-in-law god, you've got a daughter, you've got sister goddesses. All of these ideas come in, and that knitting together is where, in my mind, Hinduism appears in a historical sense.
I mean, we've all got that one uncle in our family who's always like, oh, that is actually originally Indian. So that's clearly where this whole, everything that comes into India becomes, oh, that is originally Hinduism.
For people of faith, I understand that your faith requires you to believe that this descended from heaven in exactly this pristine form. And I respect that because that's the position of faith. But my job as somebody who studies history is to also historicize, because these things evolve over a period of time, and it's not just Hinduism, all religions. When Islam fanned out around the world, in different parts of the world, it took different forms. Islam in Malabar was very different from Islam in Kashmir, to the extent that in the 1940s, the Muslim League sent a representative to Kashmir hoping to woo Kashmiri Muslims, and that representative wrote a report saying that this isn't even Islam, like what is this strange religion they practice? We'll have to teach them proper Islam. Because theirs was a very localized kind of Islam, very different from what they practiced in, say, Bhopal or parts of central India and so on. So all religions are also subject to historical processes and historical changes. And that's true of Hinduism just as it is of other religions.
Got it. So there's this one analogy that comes into the book quite frequently, which is the river. And like any river has multiple origin points, right? It starts at multiple streams. So very quickly, can you kind of walk us through the point at which the book begins? Just to let you all know, the book is the story of 400 years. So get us to the point at which these 400 years begin, so that we all know where the stage is set.
So you've got these different streams, going around. There's Shaivism, there's Vaishnavism, there's Shaktism, there are all these tribal cults. There's things happening at a very local, very granular kind of level. And as I said, there's a framework that's trying to place all of this together. And the analogy I use is of a tapestry. This is like a tapestry that's being constantly woven. It's constantly expanding in different directions. It doesn't have an outer border. That impulse to stitch up an outer border happens because of stress, because of pressure. In some ways, you do see evidence of this first appearing in the Islamic period, as it were, when there are Islamic rulers in the country. Because now suddenly Brahmins and the elites of Hindu society are face to face with a different kind of vision of the world, a different faith system, a different idea of God, and so on. And it's interesting because you see evidence in the writings of Kabir, in the writings of Eknath. They have these two master categories of the Hindu and the Turk. It doesn't mean that the diversity within the Hindu camp is gone, but they do recognize that there are these two broad categories that are forming. It's not communalism as we know it today. It's a very loose sense, so that stitching up to the outer borders is a very loose kind of stitching up. It's still not picked up in a serious way. It picks up in a serious way because of modernity, because of the modern period and colonialism, and in many ways the encounter with Christianity rather than Islam. Islam is a big part of the puzzle, and in how Hinduism eventually responds and develops a sense of self vis-a-vis someone else. Now, again, I give an analogy in the book, which is that if there are 4 brown people sitting in a room, at that time you're squabbling with each other even, you're very different, but you don't think of your brownness as a way to assert an identity. But when a white person enters the room and the white person is also menacing in some way, that's when your brownness becomes a means to articulate a shared kind of response to that. That's when you start using brown as a mark of identity. Yeah. So think of it as something like that. When you're faced with pressure from the outside, when you're faced with something else, that's when you have to figure out how you define yourself. If I'm sitting alone in a room, I don't have to announce my name to anyone. Okay. I'm just in my room, I know who I am. But when a Mansi enters the room is when I have to come up and say, oh, hi, my name is Manu, and you are a Mansi. And that's how we distinguish, each other, from one another. So you see some of that happening, and then, of course, we get to the Portuguese period and all of those events.
So I'm going to go back to the river analogy. And one of the things in this book, one of the words that comes up in the book a lot is fluidity. I think the religion is a very fluid religion. Other words that come up in the book are like plasticity, flexibility, malleability. This is the kind of terminology.
As you can tell, Mansi is my editor, and she's clearly checked all this.
But this is the terminology that repeats itself, and that is the thing that has defined what we now know as Hinduism, up until the point when Hinduism starts to define itself. And then the definition begins to limit the way in which it keeps expanding and contracting and assimilating and consolidating and all of that. Is the definition just a limiting thing altogether?
See, to begin with, while of course at different levels people have always tried to define their religion and whatever, this broad-based labeling of whole cultures is largely a modern preoccupation. Yeah. It's in the modern world that we've fallen into this we've developed this great appetite to label everything, to put everything into a box, to view the world in this specifically structured way. That's a very modern phenomenon. Of course, that impulse existed earlier, which is why we were able to do it with such ease. Yeah. It's not something the British came and imposed on us. If the British brought in that kind of vision of the world, that kind of boxing template, we were able to adapt to that because we had impulses within that enabled us to do that. So there's already that kind of impulse existing. But I would never say that fluidity is completely gone. I'll tell you a story. In Kerala, I think we have a deity, Murugan. And the story goes that there was once a kid who was unwell or something. And he wasn't getting better. And eventually the parents, I think the kid might even have been a Muslim kid. The parents took him to this Murugan temple. And the kid had a munch chocolate in his hand. And he put that munch in front of the deity, and later he recovered. And since then, the deity is called Munch Murugan, and everybody who goes to the temple places not any chocolate, but specifically the brand of munch with front of this deity. There's another popular story about how there was a priest in a temple who used to feed a cat every day before he did the puja inside, simply because the cat was there. That was all. After the puja, he used to give the cat some of the prasadam. Then at some point, the priest died. And then the priest's son became the head priest, and he had seen his father doing this. So he also started giving the cat the prasadam, till eventually it became the case that the cat had to be given the prasadam first, and only then everybody else. Some of these stories may be apocryphal, but these are recent stories, which means that tendency to change, that tendency to have that, retain that fluidity in many ways still remains. But at an intellectual level, where you're defining Hinduism to the world, where you're standing up and sort of defending your cultural identity in a time of colonization, in a time when you're surrounded by white people, you see a sense of hostility in the air because you're ruled by the white man. It's in that context that there is a certain rigidity. And I think that rigidity does appear in terms of Hinduism's political manifestation, because political assertion of identity is built on homogeneity, it's built on people coming together and asserting a certain muscle. So that tension is now very visible, that there is a tendency towards regimentation, and that in some ways is limiting fluidity. But at the same time, I will say that the fluidity also has a way of thriving and continuing to survive. In Hinduism, no matter how much you try to regiment it, there is still elements of fluidity and change within it.
And there's this brilliant sentence in the book. You'll have to tell us the exact structure. Pluralism is very charming, but regimentation
is essential for survival. Regimentation is essential for survival.
Yeah, so pluralism is very charming, but regimentation is essential for survival is kind of, to me, in a nutshell.
This, by the way, isn't my view. I'm sort of paraphrasing, a certain perspective.
But kind of in a nutshell, that's why Hinduism begins to define itself. But as you also said, like, I am a brown person in relation to the fact that there is a white person in the room. I am Manasi because you are Manu. This relational aspect exists. And where I wonder if it gets dangerous is then we start, did Hinduism start defining itself in that relational context? So this is, like, you have a holy book, so then this is our holy book, and so on and so forth, right? You're constantly defining it in terms of what it is not, because there is something else, there is the other in the room. Is that a dangerous phenomenon for Hinduism? Is that how the Hindu identity begins to define itself?
I don't know if it's dangerous or not. I don't want to make a value judgment, but I will say that if you look at most religions, there is some sense of the other. So even if you look at Christianity taken form at one point, it does define itself against Judaism. And in fact, both start to become isms based on feeding off each other. This is what you are, this is what I am, this is what makes us different. So there is that sense that all religions need an other in order to figure out where the boundaries begin and where they end. Right? So to that extent, that's there. But yes, I think in many respects, from the modern period, this desire to regiment ourselves has been a preoccupation of Hindu intellectuals, of people who've mobilized Hindus politically and all of that. And as I said, understandably, because of the political context in which they worked.
So initially, when the Christian encounter begins, there's the sense that there's a non-threatening sense in which Indians respond to the arrival of the missionaries. A, why? And B, when does it start responding as like a stress test? You said they respond as if it's a stress test. So they were so unthreatened by the arrival of the missionaries. At what point do they start feeling threatened?
So the early Europeans had some very strange ideas about Hindu society, because they came out of a culture where even as Christianity spread through Europe, Europe also at one point was pagan. They also worshipped trees and sacrificed animals and had deities and idols and all of those things. And as Christianity spread into Europe and parts of Britain and all of that, there was this fear of the idol. There was a sense that gods worshipped in images were representatives of Satan. These are satanic forces. You have accounts of saints breaking statues, and then out of these statues, strange, dark, mystifying beasts emerge, and strange birds emerge, and all kinds of weird things happen, because these are not gods. These are demonic forces. There is only one God, and the path to that God was through the Bible. That was the understanding. And it's essentially this gaze that they bring to India as well. Of course, in India, it's not helped by the fact that when they look at temples, now they'll see a Narasimha, and I've got a picture of Narasimha in this, coming out of a pillar, ripping open another human being, and they're like, how is this God? They look at a Kali temple in a dark sanctum with lots of lamps around. Kali is in this ferocious sort of form, and animals are being sacrificed. How can this be God? So again, in their worldview, this is again not to attack or blame. I'm saying that because they came out of a certain worldview, they applied their cultural lenses to what they were seeing to make sense of what they were seeing. So they saw this and they were like, oh, this is the same thing. These are satanic forces, these are demonic forces. Very quickly they realized that this is not working, because if they thought they were going to bring the light of the Bible and everybody would sort of wake up, that did not happen. The Hindus seemed to perfectly continue with their so-called demonic gods, while the missionaries weren't having that kind of a success.
And in fact, they're almost like, come, more the merrier. Let's have more gods
Yeah,
in the house.
in fact, I'll get to that, because in a way they actually Hinduize Christianity. That also ends up happening. So what happens is they then start studying Hinduism. So you have these debates taking place in places like Calicut, where a missionary will come and he'll say, your gods, you've got this one Krishna running around with the gopis. How can he be God? God is a very well-behaved kind of force. Krishna is not well-behaved. He's a romantic kind of figure, so he can't be God. You've got Ganapati. He's got the head of an elephant, the body of a man. Of course, in European depiction, his trunk grows out of his chin, and there's one image in which he has nice curls also, very like European blonde curls. So they're like, and he moves around on a rat. How can this be a god? That's what they're saying. At this time, the Hindus are also just amused, because look, the power equation is even. This is India. Europeans don't rule here yet, except in pockets like Goa, where there has been violence by now. So the Indians are just amused by these white people trying to sort of destabilize their sense of God. And they say, oh, well, if you're criticizing our gods, how can you say then that Jesus was divine and God's son if the Jews were able to put him up on a cross and essentially kill him? So that means he isn't God either. Then they'll say that you say that idol worship is bad, but you take out processions of the Virgin Mary. Isn't that a form of idolatry? So there's a debate taking place. It's a debate of equals that's taking place. One thing you'd also find is that throughout this encounter, in different parts of India, in different centuries, 18th, 17th, in the early encounters, you find that all these Hindu Brahmins who are talking to these missionaries often come up with the same response, which is that we are not denying that Christianity is a way to God. We are not denying the value of the Bible. We respect Jesus as God's son. That much also we'll accept. What we do deny is that this is the only way to God. And there's this one analogy which they give to an 18th century missionary, I think, where they say that just as a trader, in order to bring different customers to his shop, has multiple products on his counter, God has also created multiple options for humankind. Because then when the missionary insists that the Bible is the only way to God, the logical counter argument they would make is, if the Bible is the only way to God, why didn't God give it to us directly? God would know. God is omnipotent. God is all over. God is all loving. God would not single out just the white man and give him his message. God would give it to everybody equally. And this is a point that ancient pagans, even in that early encounter with Christianity in the West, also used to make. That if God had intended this for everybody, everybody would have had access to the Bible. Sometimes they also make fun of the missionaries. They'll say things like, oh, you say that we'll all go to heaven or hell. Are these multilingual places? Are all languages of the world understood? How do people communicate with each other? And to be clear, just as Europeans had stereotypes about the Hindus had stereotypes about Europeans also. One very memorable one had it that Europeans like to fry children in butter and eat them. Another one said, that, including Emperor Shah Jahan, he wasn't very happy about the fact that Europeans went to the toilet and did not use water after, and they thought this is what was barbaric and not what you saw in India. So that these kind of...
That sentiment still exists.
That sentiment still exists. So this is the level at which the encounter is taking place. So there is a fundamental feeling, or the claim on the Hindu side is that you cannot say that there is only one path to God. And they're not saying this because of their large-heartedness. To go back to what we were discussing earlier, because Hinduism itself has so many founds, because Hinduism itself is a conglomerate, a composite of so many traditions. The only way these things could hold together was by acknowledging that all of these existed. Of course, Orthodox Brahmins would create a hierarchy. They say, okay, your village goddess of smallpox is a lower god, Vishnu is a higher god. So they'd say lower and higher, but they would make space for everybody to exist. By the same logic, they'd say, okay, Christianity is a way to God, but it is not the only way to God. Now, in this context, you'll find missionaries now have a problem, which is that they need to now reorient the way Christianity is presented here. And here you have a figure like Roberto de Nobili in Madurai. In Goa, you find that where power is in the hands of a Christian state, there is force used. So there are people, temples are being demolished, the images of gods are being broken, people are fleeing and all of that. So there's violence and there's trauma in places like that. But in Madurai, which is an outpost of the Vijayanagara Empire, it's a Hindu government, a major temple, all of that, it is a missionary who has to transform. Instead of him forcing European ideas on them, he has to pick up Hindu ideas. So Roberto de Nobili gets there in the early 17th century. He starts learning Sanskrit. He wears the punul of the Brahmin. He starts wearing saffron robes. He starts sitting on the floor and eating vegetarian food out of a plantain leaf. He essentially reincarnates himself as a Guruji and says that the Bible, as I said, because the Bible was seen as the Firangi or the Parangi Vedam, the Brahmins and others were very contemptuous towards the Bible. It's for foreigners. He said, no, this is the Satya Vedam, the Veda of the truth. And just as you have the 4 Vedas, this is the 5th Veda. He essentially reorients and represents the Bible to local people there. He also, as I said, Hinduizes Christianity. So caste is accepted. So whenever he converts a Brahmin, he says, you can continue wearing your sacred thread. I'll just attach a small cross on it, and that's fine. Like this is now, you're now a Brahmin Christian. In a lot of these churches, you would find that the Brahmins were allowed to sit in front. The Dalit converts would be kept at the door. And this has continued till modern times. I have a citation from the Times of India of about 10 or 12 years ago, where you find Dalit Christians still complaining in South India that they have separate cemeteries, they're not allowed to participate in the important rites of the church, etc., because caste was internalized into Christianity. And Roberto de Nobili's logic was that this is a way of social structuring here, and in order to make Christianity acceptable to elite Hindus and persuade them to convert, we can't dismantle these aspects of their culture. We have to retain their culture and adapt Christianity to their culture. That's why I said, in that missionary encounter, the missionary also had to reinvent himself in very interesting ways. But then, as you said, the conflict begins, and the conflict begins when the power equation changes. When the British Raj becomes more and more dominant, when the white man's government starts to rule different parts of the country. As I alluded to earlier, initially, of course, they were nervous and they wanted to patronize Hindu temples and all of that. But at a certain point, pressure starts building up at home in Europe, saying, what is this? Your job is not to promote Brahmins, and your job is not to support temples and take deities, Hindu deities in procession. Your job is to support the missionary enterprise.
So let's come back to the politics of it in a little while. What also happens while this is happening in the early encounter between Hinduism and Christianity is they also make their way to Akbar's court, which is a completely different ball game, right? Because everything is acceptable in Akbar's court, and he is curious about everything and brings this extraordinary curiosity to even the missionary encounter. So let's talk about that.
I mean, there's this one thing where the missionaries see trans people in Akbar's, capital, and they're like, who are these people? They must be burnt up. And Akbar is just amused. He's like, they're just going about their lives. Why are you getting so agitated about these trans women around? But he's open-minded because again, he's crafting very much an Indian form of an Indic kingship, right? So he's drinking Ganga Jal, he's fasting on certain days, he's promoting vegetarianism because the Jains want certain days to be vegetarian. At the same time, he's also debating with the Muslim clerics in his court. Some of them are very upset with him. So he's mixing things up. So And by the way, this is about the Hindu encounter with missionaries. There's actually a whole book to be written about the Muslim encounter with missionaries.
Are you going to write it?
No, not me. But this has squeezed the loud life out of me. I don't think I have it in me to do one more of these. And as I said, I was paranoid that I'd get cancelled after this book. I'd rather not get cancelled by one more group at the end of this,
Who's going to cancel you?
I mean, it could be the left or the right, because even when I was doing the edits of this, I was like, introduction done, maybe the right will cancel me. First chapter done, maybe the left will cancel me. So it varied based on the chapter.
Okay, this of course begs the question, would you rather be cancelled by the left or the right?
As you can see, I have a very clever and testy editor. I think I would not be beaten up if I was cancelled by the left. Whereas the chances of getting beaten up are probably higher with the right. So I'll get stoned, and not in a good way, by the right. There is such cancellation that happens. Thanks, Mansi. Now you've ensured I'm going to get cancelled.
So, okay, let's come back to the early Christian encounter. So there's the encounter between the Christians and the Hindus. There's all this happening in Akbar's court, where, I don't even want to call it the encounter between Islam and Christianity, because Akbar's court is all-inclusive. It's very, accepting. Now, while all of this is happening, at what point does monotheism creep into the way we start defining Hindus? There's this one wonderful example that you give where there's this rishi in the Vedas or something who's asked how many gods there are, and he says 3,300 and something. And tell the story.
And then slowly starts to sort of bring it down and ultimately says, 7, then 3, then 1.5, and finally says, yes, it's only one god. But so the thing is, again, the missionary idea is that they see all these temples. They see all these gods. There's the village god, there's the major god, there's the higher god, lower god. And they're like, the Hindus clearly believe these are all separate gods. So they think this is a purely polytheistic system. But the Brahmins often respond, and by the way, note here that a lot of these Hindus, when they come face to face with the missionaries, they often point to the Brahmin, saying, stop harassing us, go ask a Brahmin, he'll be able to answer your questions. So there's also one thing I noticed is that there is an implicit recognition that when you come face to face with another person or another group, the spokesperson in some ways who can address these questions is often the Brahmin, and a scholarly Brahmin. Not just your local pujari, but a scholarly Brahmin. One of these missionaries called Ziegenbach in the 18th century, the first Protestant missionary in the country, there are these fabulous letters he exchanged with these Hindu spiritual leaders, many of them Brahmins, many non-Brahmins. But even in that, you have some of the non-Brahmins writing back saying, sorry it took so long to respond to you. All the Brahmins were away because of bad weather, so it took time for me to get the information. Or they'll say that I'm answering your questions, but I'm not consulted the Brahmins. So you see, there's an interesting recognition that the Brahmin is the figure who's meant to address these questions. So they say, no, we acknowledge monotheism, we believe there is one God, but God appears in many, many forms. Just as God was born in your part of the world as his son was born as Jesus, here God took 10 avatars as Vishnu, and we worship all 10 avatars at different moments. So they find a way of reconciling the multiplicity of cultures and gods that are available on the ground with the soul, with a conscious idea of that sole, omnipotent, formless kind of God. In fact, by the 19th century, when Raja Ram Mohan Roy is actively trying to construct an intellectual defense of Hinduism, he in fact says that actually, if you think about it, the Hindu idea of monotheism is superior to the Christian one, because the Christian one still divides God as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, whereas we in Advaita have the idea of this formless, abstract God who actually can't be split at all. It's just this, it's one notch higher than Christianity. So he says that far from us converting, if we converted to Christianity, it would be like converting from one system to another form of superstition. That's what he essentially ends up representing. But in the course of all this, there's a lot of internalizing of the Western critique as well. Especially as European power grows in the country, people become more and more sort of testy. They become more and more nervous about this encounter. It's no longer a debate between equals. Now you feel that the white man is in government, the white man is sweeping up all these territories, the white man is controlling the temples, he's the one who's paying the salaries of the Brahmins in state-controlled temples. So suddenly the white man and his religion is a very conscious, serious presence there. A lot of Hindus, of course, in their old-fashioned style, come up with stories to explain this. One memorable story that I can't stop repeating is where they say that, you know why Christianity exists? Because they have to acknowledge, now Christianity is in front of you, you have to find some way of explaining why it's in front of you. So they say, the Hindu traditions were doing so well and everybody was getting so spiritually uplifted that heaven was getting overpopulated. And the cosmic balance was getting, skewed because there was nobody in hell. So to restore cosmic balance, God created this new religion so that some souls would get waylaid to go into hell and then things would be balanced again. And by the way, this template wasn't created against Christians. You find this in Shaiva and Vaishnava polemics. Fightings between them, they applied this template as well. Vaishnavas will say, God created Shaivism to waylay some people and sort of restore cosmic balance. So it's an old template now modified to understand Christianity but in a negative tone. You find a case where during these Ramlila performances in North India, they'll find that final effigy of Ravana and then you shoot a flaming arrow at it. Often the effigy would be dressed in the clothes of the English East India governor. And, so people weren't marching on the street agitating, but there was a way of showing that there was some discomfort about what was happening. At this point, these debates become very, very sort of negative. They become very polemical. They become very angry. But there are great debates happening. In Bombay, there's cases where hundreds of people gather, much like this, and sort of there are public debates that take place between a Hindu spiritual figure, like say Vishnu Baba Brahmachari, and missionaries who come. In Banaras and places, there are great debates taking place between missionaries and the Hindus. And as I said, the Hindus are also internalizing some of the critique. So Ram Mohan Roy, even as he promotes Advaita Vedanta and this esoteric idea of a metaphysical, formless kind of God and a pure Hindu monotheism, in some ways he's borrowing the Western structure. Just as in the West there was this narrative that there was Christianity, then a Protestant narrative, that there was Christianity, Catholicism corrupts Christianity, and then you have the Protestant Reformation to restore pure pristine Christianity. Ram Mohan Roy also believes that there was a pure Hinduism. It got corrupted into the Puranic form. Historically, it's not a corruption. Puranas actually where Hinduism is taking form, really. But he reads it as a corruption, and it is now the duty of Indian Hindu reformers to restore pristine Hinduism. So you're essentially taking that Western framework, applying it to Hinduism to develop a kind of renaissance. So there's an internalization there. If you look at Ram Mohan Roy's writings, the same criticism that missionaries have against Krishna and his gopis, he will also make. Because he's also a bit embarrassed that, yes, we do have gods who are running around and playing, they're playful and they're romantic and they have carnal instincts and all of that. So you do see that the Western gaze sort of comes into play, and how we define Hinduism is also afflicted by that Western gaze.
But this is also the time, like when Ram Mohan Rai, Dayanand Saraswati, Phule, they all begin to sort of borrow the tools of how the West comes to India, the Christian encounter. They borrow these tools to fight back, and that's how we get what we end up with, which is the Hindu identity, which of course later gets taken up by Savarkar and Tilak and so on. But I keep going back to this Audre Lorde quote, which is, you cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. What would have been the alternative? What would have been our own tools to dismantle the master's house in that case?
Well, clearly, I don't think they were able to find a compelling set of tools in that particular moment. In hindsight, we can say many things. I mean, I still believe the strength of Hindu culture has always been pluralism. It is that capacity to accept, to incorporate, and to move on. Like, there's a way in which it's quite fascinating that every time Hinduism or Hindu culture comes across something awkward, some awkward corner it can't negotiate, you'll have a new legend being created, and that's also navigated, and you move on. So I still think that is what made the Hindu culture at that time resilient to a lot of these efforts to convert and so on. But again, living under colonial pressures where you had this happening in front of your eyes, I suppose people at that time felt that they had to resist with the weapons that were available to them. And I don't think it's illegitimate, because even if you look at another example I often give, is that the very first meeting of the Indian National Congress in 1885, that circular says all delegates should be able to speak the English language. So the first gathering of proto-nationalism in this country, organized proto-nationalism in this country, still needed the colonizers' language, because we didn't have a linked language these people were able to speak. But we were able to appropriate that English language, weaponize it against the people who brought it to this country. Right? Gandhiji hated the railways, but he traveled extensively across the country through railways, and at every platform he'd pop his head out, crowds would gather, he'd just have to shout a slogan, and that platform would be turned into a political platform. So he uses railways that the British have created for their benefit to his advantage, right? So you see that there is a very creative, selective appropriation of Western ideas. It's not a complete appropriation, it is a selective appropriation. You know that this is essentially the system that the foreigner has brought in, but you're not just accepting it lying down. You're accepting it, but then turning it around for your own purposes. And in that, there is a certain dynamism, I thought.
So, I mean, is pluralism then what we now need to go back to what ideally we should have been, which is like a wildly pluralistic society, to go back to that tapestry that you started talking about?
I mean, I suppose that would be the ideal case scenario. But since you've cancelled me already, it again doesn't seem like the powers that be are interested in that kind of pluralism.
Yeah.
As far as I see the effort, even when people talk about decolonization, they're pushing still a kind of homogenization, which I don't understand. It's quite tragic to me that if Kerala's practice of Hinduism started resembling North Indian Hinduism, each has its place, each has its specific history. You know, at Malayali weddings now that I go, I keep seeing that, you know, they now apply sindoor and all of these things. We never had it. My mother got married in the 80s, and even in her time, there was no sindoor that was applied at weddings. There's a kind of borrowing and all of that.
Yeah.
The only counterpoint to it would be that this is also a form of evolution, I suppose. We may not like it, but maybe this is how it's evolving at this juncture. Remember, at every point that Hinduism took these turns in its journey, the turns of the river, there would have been people who did not like it, right?
Yeah.
And perhaps we are also that minority that doesn't like it,
Yeah.
even though there is a different kind of evolution taking place now. You and I may not like that evolution, but it is evolution, I suppose, of some form.
I mean, I would still love for us to go back to pluralism. I want to take it to audience questions, but before that, since I've cancelled you anyway, let me ask you one final cancelable question. Do you identify as a Hindu?
That's a interesting question. I would say yes, but not in a conventional way where I think firstly that there is a God up there for us. I'm not entirely convinced by that. But I do go to Shiva temples, partly because my favorite temple in Kerala, which my family has been connected to for 1,000 years, they say, is a Shiva. In fact, in the dedication of the book, you'll see the 1,000-year-old man in a certain place, and that certain place is that temple. It's a very small, obscure temple, was ruined for the longest time. And I don't necessarily go there and look at the Shivalingam and think of, oh, this is God. What I see there is that for 1,000 years, or for at least many centuries, my ancestors have been going and looking at the same Shivalingam. For 1,000 years, all the people in that community, that agrarian community from which I am descended, people have gone into that place and looked at that same Shivalingam. So, frankly, our lives on this earth are like cockroaches' lives. We are here, we die. That's it. I don't think there's further meaning to it. But we are able to feel some sense of timelessness by stepping into spaces, any sacred space that's been around for a long enough time. I think we are able to somehow transcend the limits of this place and see something that people before us have seen, and in all likelihood, people after us will also see. When that Shivalingam came, it's possible, you know, that region would have had a very different history. It was an age of kings and tribal chieftains and lords. Today we're living in the age of democracy, but that Shivalingam is still sitting there in that small shrine in that little village to this day. So that gives me some sense of romance in an otherwise very jaded, unromantic, rather tedious world.
Okay, let's take this to you guys. Please take, is there a mic floating around somewhere?
Who has the mic?
I think we need to wait for the mic to get to you, sir.
Are there volunteers?
Okay, I seem to have got the mic first. Hi.
Where are you? There.
The question I wanted to ask is, you talk about the influence and the change of You talk about the influence on Hinduism mostly through a lens of the Christian and colonialism. But the Puranas itself are written at a period when probably it's the invasions of the Mughals and the Islam. So that itself was the first change from the Vedic to the
Actually, no, the Puranas are
theistic.
older. So the Puranas, we believe, were more or less codified by the Gupta period, the main Puranas, and a lot of them continued, of course, the Upa Puranas, and changes kept happening in a later period.
So the question was, so the shift from the monotheistic Vedic culture to this plural, multiple gods system is not, you see, as a result of the Islamic or the other invasions. It's a natural phenomenon.
See, although also I would say that calling it a shift from one to the other is simplistic, because one set of people believed in one set of ideas. They came face to face with several other people who had different ideas, and there's a coalescing that takes place.
so
That
it's
coalescing is what happens in the
an
Puranic period.
evolution.
It's not the replacement of one by the other.
So it's not a reaction, it's an evolution.
Yeah, it's a change based on historical dynamics. And I think one argument to be made is that kind of Puranic impulse, the other in many ways is Buddhism. It is not Islam. It is Buddhism, and then of course Islam comes in later.
Okay, thank you.
Where are you? Oh, there. Ah, yes, sir. Oh, wait, where? Oh, two. Okay, wait. This first, then you, sir. Yeah.
My name is Murli. I really liked your presentation. I was reading this influence of Africa.
Please continue.
Hello.
Yeah.
There is this book called Decolonizing the Mind by African writer Akbar, and there is a book written by an African writer, Decolonizing the Mind. Because the Africans also kind of like went through the same kind of colonial, but it was more brutal than India, right? Then there is this Chepe who wrote about things fall apart. There is a Christian missionary entering a village, and this whole world falls apart. So, do you have any insight about how we responded and how Africans responded,
I don't know about the Africans, but this book has lots on how we responded. And as I said, the responses varied from laughing at some of the missionary claims to actively fighting it. So, sometimes people got angry. You have this one case of Ziegenbach, the missionary in the 18th century. He has an account where he was sleeping in an inn, and apparently there was a bunch of angry Brahmins who saw him, and they knew he was a troublemaker, and they even plotted to get rid of him. Now, it could be that he was exaggerating, but that's one case. In other places, the same missionary goes and meets other Hindus who just laugh at him. And they're like, has God saved all of you in Europe that you've now come here to save us? Like, why don't you go and take care of your own flock? We've got our own ways. There's a third person who says that, look, given my karma and my habits, I'm bound to be damned in my religion as well as your religion. So why bother through the inconvenience of converting when I'm going to go to hell anyway? So there were different responses, but, it varied. Yeah.
Okay, I've been told we can take 2 more questions, so let's keep them as brief as possible,
We'll take 3 more
please.
questions.
Okay, first of all, I congratulate both of you for taking this discussion. I have a question and a suggestion. My question is that how can we suggest a solution to the destructive forces created by the 3 elements that we have taken for this: gods, guns, and missionaries? What is a suggestion you have for the future? And my suggestion is, both of you together, please write a book, and I will publish it for the next year's discussion. I will publish it. What is the solution to save humanity from the destructive power of the 3 elements?
Thank you, sir. That's a very serious question. I'm not sure I have the solution to it. But I think sometimes we allow these concepts that emerged through historical processes, some of them unpleasant, to continue to drive us. And this is what you were saying earlier as well, right? These are frameworks that have come from the West. And in many ways, our communalism, our fighting over religion, is in some ways a product of these frameworks. And we still continue to go through that. Even people who are claiming to decolonize continue to go through that. I think in rejecting that framework, it means rejecting all of this baggage. And that needs, I think, leaders of vision and imagination and people who are really able to rise up from what we are today. And which, neither Mansi nor I, maybe Mansi can, but I can't. But hopefully we will find somebody who's able to do that.
But I think you'll also find, for those of you who have read the book, I think Manu has kind of answered the question a little bit in the book itself, because we go back to pluralism over and over again, and I think that is the answer. Okay, we've got 1 more question. Let's keep it brief and let's make it
Hi, my name is Dinesh. So I believe a lot of research has been done before writing the book. So, example in Bhagavad Gita or Bhagavatam, it is what we are not talking about 400 years or 500 years. We're talking about 5,000 years ago, which is all written and told. Okay, so hope we have to go again and research much better and come back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
And that's a question.
And,
That's yeah. There was a lady at the back who had a question, a young girl. Yes, that girl. It's only 6:28. We're till 6:30. 2 more minutes.
Willie's waiting right there.
Yeah, but he's at 6:30. Billion we don't mind, right? 2 more minutes. Yes. That girl. That girl there, yes. Last question, yeah. Our minutes are running out. Quick.
Do you think we would have defined ourselves differently as Hindus if we were colonized primarily by the Portuguese or the French instead?
That's an interesting question. I don't want to do a what if, but The Portuguese were actually pretty violent in Goa, so I don't think we would have had too different a response. Even when, and you see a lot of resistance to that violence, even though the Hindus were at the weaker end of the equation. So you'll find, say, the Portuguese destroy a temple and the deity has to be sort of go into exile from there. But in response, what they'll do, they'll take the deity outside Goa, just at the edge of Goa, and build an even bigger temple, almost as if taunting the Portuguese. You'll find that the Portuguese sometimes forced people to convert, and then Brahmins would devise ways to reconvert them. Some kind of archaic form of Ghar Vapsi, as they would call it today. But, so don't cancel me. But the point is, I don't think it would have been all that different, because again, they're coming out of a certain kind of worldview where there is only one truth and everything else is denied as falsehood. Whereas here the system was that there are many truths. There is one truth, but there are many paths to that truth. No one person has a monopoly on the truth. And I think therefore the response perhaps would have been the same.